Okay, so the poet we'll spend some time with this week, and there's a collection of his poems, really just four of them, for you to read and actively learn, is Rainier Maria Rilke. That might be a weird middle name for you. I don't know actually why his middle name is Maria, but I do know that when he was born into kind of a tough spot, his mother was mourning the loss of an infant daughter who had preceded Rilke. And so, in her agony over the loss of her child, she dressed Rilke in girls' clothes for a long time, and called him by a girl's name, and that continued on for a while. And then later on, his dad, who had lost his job and was kind of like not really all that successful, him and his mom decided to send Rainier to military school. So, kind of a tough childhood for Rilke. Out of which, though, he became one of Germany's most celebrated poets. So he's considered to be the most influential poet of the 20th century. We haven't really spent much time in Germany in our discussion so far this year, but if we were to have, we would have read Goethe's Faust, and Rilke connected to Goethe. We're kind of seen as like the two major leading German literary artists in the 19th and then into the 20th century. So Rilke's questions are going to seem really religious. He spends a lot of time talking about God and talking about angels and talking about kind of like religious sentiments. But for Rilke, these questions were always answerable through art and through the artistic experience. This biographer of Rilke says this: where others have found a unifying principle for themselves in religion or morality or the search for truth, Rilke found his in the search for impressions and the hope these could be turned into poetry. For him, art was what mattered most in life. And this was definitely coincided with his own lifestyle. So throughout his life, he wandered throughout Europe and he stayed in various places. He wrote some of his best work later in his life when he was invited to stay by himself at a castle in Italy called Duino. And he wrote the Duino elegies while he was there, which were ultimately 10 long form poems that gave expression to some of his deepest questions about the nature of art and about the nature of poetry. He wrote what he called, and I'm not even going to attempt to make a sense of this word in German, but these things that he called thing poems. And that was because he wanted to do a similar kind of thing that these impressionistic artists were doing, which was to look at the object itself and to try to make some artistic claim about the object as the poet saw it. So when you get into his poems a little bit later, the first one that you'll read, Archaic Torso of Apollo, will be him looking at this piece of art and its destruction. There's no head on this statue of Apollo. It's just a torso, and yet still finding within the sculpture and the way that it's arranged, not something that connects us to Apollo, the god, not valuable because it's an illusion, but valuable because it's a concrete thing itself, and the thing gives us a sense of meaning. So I want to read this quote for you because Rilke is kind of a pre-existentialist in the same way that Dostoevsky is. These two guys are asking similar kinds of questions, and actually spent a lot of time with Dostoevsky's contemporary Tolstoy, who wrote Anna Karenina, and he also wrote War and Peace. War and Peace is considered to be like the best novel ever, but it's like 1,000 bajillion pages long, which isn't to say you shouldn't read it, but it is to say that I haven't read it. Anyway, so existential doubt is something that was at the core of Rilke. This other biographer, Butler, says, what Rilke learned is what every artist has to face sooner or later, the realization that life is much more creative than art. Dream, the apotheosis of art, apotheosis just means to like elevate something to the level of the sacred, appeared to be founded on delusion. Either art was not as creative as he had thought, or he was not such a great artist. Both these doubts were parallel and quite sufficient to account for the terrible apprehension present in every line of his first and only novel. For this skepticism struck at the roots of his reason and justification for existence. Either he was the prophet of a new religion, or he was nobody. This doubt tends to pervade his latter writings and have made them really delightful and continue to make them delightful for people who are asking these same kinds of questions of self-worth, questions of our own vision and understanding of the world, questions of our ability to make something of what we find the world to be. We'll see Rilke have echoes in the next major artist that we'll spend time with, Kafka. And we'll see next week when we talk a little bit more about James Joyce and Kafka, the connection between all of these kinds of artists and the ways in which they're taking the reality and the history and the socio-political climate of their day and pushing it into new artistic expressions that hadn't been seen before. This is a bit of a callback. So this picture itself is a self-portrait of Courbet, who we discussed last week when we were looking at the Impressionists. He was a realist. You'll remember from that presentation. His goal was just to see objects as they were, right? Which is exactly Rilke's goal as well, to kind of say, like, let's look at the object as a source for inspiration. So Rilke, in that sense, is sort of what we talked about, realism and impressionism, sort of two sides of the same coin, even though they saw themselves greatly at odds. Here's Rilke's question. How is it possible to live when, after all, the elements of this life are utterly incomprehensible to us? How is it possible to live when, after all, the elements of this life are utterly incomprehensible to us? This is Hamlet's question, right? To be or not to be. We are what is it? Thus conscience makes cowards of us all, right? This is the underground man's problem, right? You can tell me that 2 + 2 = 4, but I don't like it, and I would love instead of 2 + 2 = 5. And this is Rilke's problem, and in a bit we'll see this is also what Gabriel in The Dead is struggling with, and this is what Gregor Samsa in The Metamorphosis is going to struggle with as well. What do we do with this world that we find? We can't even understand, right? Remember